Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us in our online stream at First Unitarian Church of Toledo. Just a couple of announcements today. Actually, our biggest one is our Wednesdays coming up. We will be hosting Black Lives Matters vigils. Sign up for one or more Wednesday evening vigils for Black Lives Matter on the front lawn of our First Unitarian Church through July 22nd. The purpose of these weekly vigils is to give everyone a chance to express grief and concern about unwarranted police killing of people of color and about systemic racial oppression. Social distancing is required and are highly encouraged to keep all participants safe. Some cloth masks will be available for those who don't have one. Because the church is closed, participants will need to bring their own water, sun protection, chairs if needed, and anything else you'd like or you think you may need. Bring a sign if you'd like to hold one. UU-themed signs will be posted on the lawn. We are hoping for between 3 and 10 participants at all times for 1 or 2 hour shifts. A link to Sign Up Genius can be found in the weekly FYI or on our Facebook page. You may contact one of the organizers where you sign up, Carol Kierlaber, Karen Porter, Krista Schneider, or Tom Sheehan.
Our opening words today are from Kathleen McTighe, who was involved with the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. Those who lived before us, who struggled for justice and suffered injustice before us, have not melted into the dust and have not disappeared. They are with us still. The lives they lived hold us steady. We take them with us, and with them, we choose the deeper path of living.
Our chalice lighting is called The Struggle for Freedom by Paul Sprecher. We light this chalice in memory of the courage of those who have struggled for freedom, the persistence of those who have struggled for justice, and the love of those who have built beloved communities to carry the light of hope. Please join me in our covenant. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another.
Today's hymn was written by James Weldon Johnson, a contemporary of Ida Wells. Not only was he an accomplished hymn writer, he was an accomplished poet and writer, as well as an early leader of the NAACP. This song has been described as the Negro National Anthem, and I'm sure you've heard it before at other national events. Number 149, Lift Every Voice and Sing.
Please join us in singing with the lyrics on the screen. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the story will be led by Kristen Olson, our RE director.
So today's story is about cooperation. It's from stories taken from Huggin and the Turnip in the 7-Year-Old Wonder book by Isabel Wyatt. Once upon a time, there was a little boy called Benji. And Benji, more than anything else in the world, wanted to have a turnip lantern for midwinter festival time. So Benji went to the garden and planted a turnip seed. And Benji said to the turnip, "Turnip, turnip, grow for me. Grow as big can be, that I might make for midwinter time the finest lantern that ever did shine. I want to put a candle in my turnip." The sun shone down on the turnip seed, and the rain watered the turnip seed, and the turnip started to grow. It grew, and it grew, and it grew, until it was the biggest, roundest, juiciest turnip that anyone had ever seen. Finally, Benji decided it was time to pull up the turnip. He went into the garden and took hold of the turnip top and started to pull. And he pulled, but the turnip did not budge 1 inch. Just then, into the garden came Mother. "What are you doing, Benji?" "I'm trying to pull up a turnip. Mother, pull with me. Pull as hard can be." So Mother took hold of Benji, and Benji took hold of the turnip, and they just pulled and they pulled, but the turnip did not budge 1 inch. Just then, into the garden came Grandfather. "What are you doing, Benji?" "I'm trying to pull up a turnip." Grandfather, pull with me. Pull as hard can be." So Grandfather took hold of Mother, and Mother took hold of Benji, and Benji took hold of the turnip, and they pulled, but the turnip did not budge 1 inch. Just then, into the garden came Rabbit. "What are you doing, Benji?" "I'm trying to pull up a turnip." Rabbit, pull with me. Pull as hard can be." So Rabbit took hold of Grandfather, and Grandfather took hold of Mother, and Mother took hold of Benji, and Benji took hold of the turnip, and they pulled, but the turnip did not budge 1 inch. Just then, into the garden came Mouse. "What are you doing, Benji?" "I'm trying to pull up a turnip." Mouse, pull with me. Pull as hard can be." So Mouse took hold of Rabbit, and Rabbit took hold of Grandfather, and Grandfather took hold of Mother, and Mother took hold of Benji, and Benji took hold of the turnip, and they pulled, but the turnip did not budge 1 inch. Just then, into the garden came Caterpillar. "What are you doing, Benji?" "I'm trying to pull up a turnip." "But," said the Caterpillar, "don't you know the right way to pull up a turnip? Have you first asked the root gnome if you may pull it up?" Well, Benji hadn't thought about asking the root gnome, so he bent down to the ground and called out, Gnome, good root gnome, may I take your turnip home, that I may make midwinter time the finest lantern that ever did shine? I want to put a candle in my turnip." Then suddenly, out from the ground next to the turnip popped the tiniest little man. "Goodness gracious, Benji," said the root gnome, "why didn't you say so in the first place? All this time, I've been pulling the other way." When really, there is nothing a root gnome likes better than to have a candle put in his turnip. "Now that you've asked me, pull again." And he popped his little head back down into the ground and disappeared. So Caterpillar took hold of the Mouse, and Mouse took hold of the Rabbit, and Rabbit took hold of Grandfather, Grandfather took hold of Mother, Mother took hold of Benji, and Benji took hold of the turnip, and they pulled. Then suddenly, the Mouse sat on top of the Caterpillar with a bang, and Rabbit sat on with a bang on top of the Mouse, and Grandfather sat down on Mother with a bang, and Benji sat with a bang on top of Mother, and Benji's hands was the biggest, roundest, juiciest turnip that anyone had ever seen. Then Benji stood up and said, sorry to Mother. Mother stood up and said, sorry to Grandfather. Grandfather stood up and said, sorry to Rabbit. And Rabbit stood up and said, sorry to Mouse. And Mouse stood up and said, sorry to a rather squashed little caterpillar. But really, no one was very hurt, and they all laughed a lot. Benji took his turnip home and put a candle in it. And Benji helped his mother make turnip soup from the middle of the turnip.
Thank you, Kristen. Today is Father's Day, and our anthem is a tune that I actually always loved with my father. It's called Father's Day by Groucho Marx and Harry Ruby. And I am always assisted by Bonnie Rowe on piano. Today, Father, it's Father's Day, and we're giving you a talk. It's not much we know, it is just our way of showing you we think you're a regular guy. You say that it was nice of us to bother, but really was a pleasure to fuss. For according to our mother, you're our father, and that's good enough for us. Today, Father, it's Father's Day, a day that we all revere. The tie that you got, it didn't cost such a lot, but we'll give you the same tie next year. You tell us it was nice of us to bother, but it really was a pleasure to fuss. For they say a child can only have one father, and you are the one for us. Yes, you are the one for us.
Thank you, Mickey. Thank you, Bonnie. I invite you now to find a comfortable position for a Father's Day reflection. Following this prayer by the Reverend Evan Carville-Zemer, we will observe a minute of silence. I believe in fathering. I believe in the radical idea that men have the full human capacity to nurture. Hair bows and baseballs, cooking and creativity, tools and tiaras, camping and dancing, snuggles and shrieks of delight. Too many fathers don't believe in their own fathering. Too many are scarred by their own fathers to hear their heart say otherwise. Too many have known fathers who, faced with a quivering lip and tears, could only say, "Man up." Too many have known fathers who knew only yelling and hitting. Too many have known fathers who lost sight of their sacred role of protector. But I believe in fathering. When a human being gestates and gives birth, her brain changes permanently. A father's brain changes permanently too. Changes as he rocks his baby to sleep, delights in baby games, and smooths bumps and bruises. A father earns his new neurobiology. In a world where too many mothers hand their co-parent directions more specific than those given to the babysitter, in a world where a father out with his kids is asked, "Are you babysitting?" or "Where's mom?" In a world where fathers are the punchline, I believe in fathering. I believe in the radical idea that men have the full capacity to nurture, whether their children come through birth, adoption, or fostering, through scouts, sports, Sunday school, or youth group. I've known too many gay dads, too many single fathers, too many men raising children others couldn't to believe otherwise. I believe we all, especially our children, deserve to know that the human capacity to nurture belongs to every one of us. I believe in fathering.
Today's reading was written by Sarah Seltzer in 2014 in response to Ferguson, Missouri protests, and it's written about Ida B. Wells. It begins with a quote by Frederick Douglass called Ida B. Wells, Anti-Lynching Crusader, was the godmother of the social justice internet, by Sarah Seltzer. Let me give thanks for your faithful paper on the lynch abomination. Frederick Douglass wrote to Ida B. Wells, brave woman, you have done your people and mine a service which can neither be weighed nor measured, he went on. Once one apprehends the extent of the prophetic journalism and anti-lynching activism of Ida B. Wells, it becomes difficult to see her as anything but one of the greatest Americans ever, at the pinnacle of the category of unsung heroines. Wells, who was born a slave and died in a new century as a lauded activist, editor, speaker, and journalist, is deserving of far more public memorializing than so many of the mediocre leaders whose busts decorate our marbled halls. For many, Wells is the patron saint of muckraking journalism and anti-racist activism. She didn't achieve this joint renown by trying to maintain a facade of, quote, objectivity or bogus neutrality. Instead, Wells saw something terribly, terribly wrong and tried to fix it using statistics, facts, and research to aid argumentative activism. She came home one day to find that a good friend had been killed by a lynch mob. From then on, her intellect frequently turned itself in one direction and one direction only, the scourge of lynching. Yet, as Douglas marveled, quote, "You have dealt with the facts with cool, painstaking fidelity and left those naked and uncontradicted facts to speak for themselves."
Ida Bell Wells was born in the midst of the Civil War in northern Mississippi, not far from Memphis. Her parents, James and Elizabeth Wells, were enslaved to a local house builder and architect who was known for building fine homes as well as the county courthouse. The Wells family lived on a small cabin on his property. After the Civil War, James Wells established his own successful business as a skilled carpenter, and Elizabeth became known as a famous cook who ran a disciplined, organized household. Each of their 8 children had assigned chores and attended Sunday school weekly at the Asbury Methodist Church. During the week, they attended a new school, Rust College, which had been founded to instruct children and adults of all ages in elementary subjects. So Elizabeth, Ida's mother, also attended alongside her children. In the summer of 1878, when Ida turned 16, a major yellow fever epidemic swept through the Mississippi Valley. Yellow fever is a deadly viral infection which produces ghastly symptoms, including jaundice after about 3 days. It is still endemic in Africa and South America. As a mosquito-borne disease, outbreaks were not uncommon in the US during the 18th and 19th centuries. When the epidemic reached Holly Springs, almost half of the population, about 1,500 people, left town. Yellow fever took both of Ida's parents as well as her 9-month-old baby brother. After the epidemic subsided, the Masons Fraternal Order, of which Ida's father had been a respected member, decided on caretaking arrangements for Ida's 6 remaining siblings. The local patriarchs determined that Ida, as the oldest, could fend for herself, while the others were to go to different families. Ida was not consulted, but that did not stop her from stepping forward to propose a different solution. She insisted that these guardians help her obtain a teaching position so that she could take care of the family herself. They scoffed, but she persisted. So at age 16, she dropped out of the Rust School, passed the state teacher's exam, and obtained a position at a rural school 6 miles outside of town. She successfully challenged the powers in her little town. For 2 difficult years, Ida taught at the country school and took care of her siblings. She rode a mule to school and sometimes had to bring firewood in the winter. During those hard years, Ida escaped by reading Dickens, Alcott, and the Brontes. When her sister Eugenia died and her grandmother had a stroke, Ida and her remaining sisters moved to Memphis to live with their aunt. Ida was able to use her 2 years teaching experience to obtain a better position at a 6-room school in Memphis. On Sundays and Wednesday evenings, she attended the Second Congregational Church of Memphis, which was led by the most educated Black minister in Memphis, the Reverend Benjamin Imes, a graduate of Oberlin College. On Friday evenings, she attended the Memphis Lyceum, a forum that included debates, readings, musical selections, and recitations. When the editor of the Lyceum's journal, the Evening Star, vacated his position, Ida was elected to fill that role. She was surprised by the vote of confidence because she did not feel that she had the required literary graces. Nevertheless, she found plenty to write about. One Saturday in September 1883, Ida boarded the train in Memphis for the little town of Woodstock where she used to teach. She was fashionably attired in a long dress, hat, gloves, and parasol. Tennessee was somewhat progressive in the New South because they had passed the first separate but equal laws for railway cars, which meant that railways were required to provide first-class cars for Black people as well as white people. When she boarded the designated first-class colored car, Ida noticed an inebriated white man and wisps of cigar smoke. That was not a suitable environment for a lady of any race. So she moved to the first-class white car. Rather than asking a white man to move or to behave appropriately in a first-class car, the conductor asked Ida to move back to the colored car. When she refused, the conductor and a few compliant passengers forced her off the train. Ida sued the railway. The judge in the court case ruled in her favor. Unfortunately, the ruling was overturned on appeal 2 years later. But perhaps we could describe Ida as the godmother of Rosa Parks' act of civil disobedience. After Ida lost the court battle, she submitted an article to a Black Baptist weekly newspaper about the court case. Her story was picked up by the country's leading Black publisher in New York, Thomas Fortune. After this journalistic success, the pastor of the Beale Street Church in Memphis, a large and growing African-American congregation, asked Ida to become the editor of the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight. Although the circulation was too small to support her, she accepted the job because she preferred journalism to teaching. So she rode trains through Mississippi, Tennessee, and Arkansas to promote the paper. Subscriptions increased from 1,500 to 4,000 so she could move into journalism full-time. After a few years, she became a partner in the business when the paper's name was shortened to the Memphis Free Speech. She started attending conventions for Black journalists and lecturing to various professional organizations in nearby cities. Ida was on a speaking tour in the spring of 1892 when she heard about the terrible lynching of a friend back home in Memphis. 2 young boys, one Black and one white, were playing marbles outside near People's Grocery, a successful Black-owned store. For some reason, they argued and began to fight. When the Black child seemed to get the upper hand, the white boy's father stepped in. 2 Black customers then came out of People's Grocery to defend the Black boy. A crowd of Blacks and whites gathered around and took sides. One of the white participants in the melee was the owner of a competing grocery store. He later accused one of the Black clerks from People's Grocery of assaulting him. Tensions escalated during the next few days. One night, a sheriff and 5 deputized civilians in plain clothes went to the People's Grocery, perhaps to arrest a suspect or perhaps to ransack the store. In any case, the Black owners and staff were prepared to defend their property. There was a shootout. No one died, but a few people sustained serious injuries. Following the shootout, hundreds of white civilians were deputized, who then went out and arrested 40 Black people, including the young marble player. They were put into the overcrowded Shelby County Jail because it was considered impregnable. At 2:30 a.m., 75 white men surrounded the jail. 9 of them managed to enter and drag out the 3 prisoners that they had targeted, including Tom Moss, owner of the People's Grocery and longtime friend of Ida's. The 3 men were taken outside of town and murdered. The details of the murders were carefully reported in 2 daily newspapers, suggesting that reporters had been called in advance to witness the lynching, and suggesting that those stories were published to show African Americans what might await them if they achieved too much success or challenged the system. When Ida returned to Memphis, she wrote a scathing editorial. The city of Memphis has demonstrated that neither character nor standing avails the Negro if he dares to protect himself against the white man or become his rival. There is only one thing left that we can do: save our money and leave a town which will neither protect our lives and property nor give us a fair trial in the courts. That editorial inspired thousands of African Americans to leave Memphis for the newly opened Oklahoma Territory. During the first year, as many as 6,000, or 20% of the black population left Memphis. Businesses, black and white, were severely impacted. 2 white managers from the Memphis City Railway visited Ida and asked her to use her influence to convince blacks to resume riding the city trolley cars. Ida was a bit surprised, but she realized during the conversation that blacks were following her advice to save their nickel and dime fares to move to Oklahoma. The managers believed that the boycott was unfair because they were always courteous to all paying customers, because the streetcar had nothing to do with the lynching, and that in fact it was operated by Northern capitalists. Ida replied that the trolleys were operated by Southern lynchers, and that those white men who stood by during the lynching had complicitly consented to the deaths of innocent black men. Ida recognized systemic racism, though she didn't use our modern term for it. And once again, we see foreshadowing of the later bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. In the wake of the Memphis murders, Ida launched a full crusade against lynching. She traveled to the scenes of other lynchings to interview eyewitnesses as well as families of the victims. In some cases, she hired private investigators to dig out the details. She wrote numerous articles which were published by her Memphis newspaper and then picked up by newspapers in other cities. Her work resulted in several Christian denominations passing resolutions to condemn lynching, including the Northern Methodists, the Northern Presbyterians, and the Congregationalists. I was disappointed to find no activity from the Unitarians or Universalists, though. As Ida gained momentum, she exposed lynchings as a public communal spectacle. Railways sold tickets to take spectators to the lynchings. One lynching reportedly attracted 10,000 people. Photographers took photos and then sold postcards. She collected data on lynchings and carefully examined the justifications for lynching. Most controversially, she reported that only a third of lynchings resulted or were justified based on alleged rape. She published her conclusions that Southerners cried rape as an excuse to hide their real reasons for lynchings: fear of Black economic progress, which threatened them with competition, and a desire to enforce second-class status on Blacks. However, some fragile people thought that she had gone too far. White men broke into the Free Speech newspaper in Memphis, destroyed the offices, and threatened anyone who might return. Fortunately, Ida was on a lecture trip and heard about this news in New York City from her professional acquaintance and friend, Thomas Fortune. He now published the New York Age, which was one of the most popular Black newspapers in America and which had a significant white readership. He convinced Ida that she could not return to Memphis. Rather than hide or back down, Ida vowed to follow through on her belief that the way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. In 1892, she published a 100-page pamphlet entitled Southern Horrors: Lynch Law in All Its Phases. 10,000 copies were printed by the New York Age. Frederick Douglass called it a revelation, It grabbed the attention of Northerners who knew little about lynching or who simply accepted the common explanation that Black men somehow deserved this fate. In 1893, Ida received an invitation to visit England. The invitation came from two women, one an English Quaker and the other a Scottish writer, both who had been involved in racial justice issues. Ida sailed to England, traveled around the country, and lectured to religious and civic groups. She sparked enough interest that one of her early audiences voted to establish the Society for the Recognition of the Brotherhood of Man. In Manchester, Wells won over a group of British Unitarian leaders who then formed their own branch of the society. Unfortunately, Ida's trip ended prematurely due to a dispute about financial support for the trip. She returned to New York after 4 months. Less than a year later, she was invited back to Great Britain by the same Society for the Recognition of the Brotherhood of Man. On this trip, her audiences averaged 1,000 or more per lecture. She made a return visit to the Manchester Unitarians and then a critical lecture to the Hope Street Unitarian Church in Liverpool. British Unitarians had been active in abolishing slavery in the colonies and in ending the global slave trade. After Wells' talk, the Unitarians passed a resolution that condemned the barbarities of lynch law and exhorted Americans in the name of common humanity to stop the practice. Reverend Richard Armstrong repeated the message in a letter to the Christian Register of Boston, the chief Unitarian publication in the US. He chastised his American peers for allowing a situation in which the Negro beneath your national flag could find no security against the nameless horrors of the amateur scaffold, the branding iron, and the stake. When she returned to the US, Ida leveraged this support from Britain to advance her campaign in the US. She published another lengthy pamphlet, The Red Record. This pamphlet contained 14 pages of statistics, as well as graphic accounts detailing specific lynchings. She emphasized that her data was taken from articles by white correspondents, white press bureaus, and white newspapers. The American Unitarian Association did listen to the British Unitarians and eventually passed an anti-lynching resolution, though it didn't seem to generate much fanfare or publicity. I've only been able to outline the first half of Ida B. Wells' life. When she returned from Britain, she moved to Chicago and at the age of 33, married Ferdinand L. Barnett. He was a prominent attorney, civil rights activist, and journalist. She chose to hyphenate her last name, which seems very progressive for 1895. Ida and Ferdinand had 4 children. She continued to travel, to lecture, and crusade against lynching, and to advocate for women's suffrage for the rest of her life. Ida Wells Barnett died in 1931 at the age of 69. If considered on a percentage basis, lynching numbers don't seem large. Nevertheless, individual lynchings were so grisly that it didn't take many of them to intimidate and terrorize. Ida Wells' efforts to raise awareness of lynching in the US and Britain had an enormous impact. Lynching peaked in 1892 at about 241 murders. During Wells' lifetime, several states in both the North and the South passed anti-lynching laws. By the time of her death, the number of lynchings had decreased to about 10 per year in the southern states. Too many, perhaps, but remarkable progress, considering that the US Congress and Senate have been unable to pass a federal anti-lynching law. Nevertheless, anti-lynching legislation has been in the news again recently. So this is not a time to be cynical about our politicians or the lack of justice in this country. As we approach our Independence Day, this is a time to lift up the ideals of one nation with liberty and justice for all. This is a time to hold our politicians accountable to those ideals. In my basic understanding, the work of the contemporary Black Lives Matter activists parallels the work of Ida B. Wells. In both cases, people work to uncover and publicize the truth about the unjust treatment of African Americans. And in the process, they reveal the underlying fears and motives that perpetuate systemic racism. For that reason, I think of Ida Wells as the godmother of Black Lives Matter. However, when I searched godmother, Black Lives Matter, I learned that some describe Rosa Parks as the godmother of Black Lives Matter. So perhaps Ida Wells is the godmother of Rosa Parks' civil disobedience, and thus the great godmother of Black Lives Matter. I was going to end there, but earlier this month, in wake of the George Floyd murder, there were protests in Nashville, Tennessee. Protesters toppled a statue of Edward Carmack, who most of us have probably never heard of. Statue was outside the Tennessee State Capitol. Carmack was a newspaper publisher who denounced Wells' anti-lynching campaign and then served one term in the US Senate. A mediocre leader at best. After toppling that statue, the protesters hung up a sign redubbing the area as Ida B. Wells Plaza. I hope that the citizens of Nashville and of Tennessee are able to make that change permanent. And I hope that you remember the words of James Weldon Johnson that Mickey sang for us this morning. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Blessed be and amen.
Thank you so much. It's a remarkable woman in the face of extreme horrors. In lieu of our membership moment today, take a moment and reflect on your need for community and why you're a member of this church. As you are moved and able, please consider visiting us at First Unitarian Church of Toledo. Under the Connection tab, you can find a donate button. I encourage you all to greet each other in the comments and on Facebook, and to take this time while we are away to build your church community, to work towards our continued goals of beloved community, anti-racism, and fulfilled spiritual life. Coming soon, we do encourage you to sign up on our the link in our FYI or on the Facebook page at Sign Up Genius for one or more Wednesday evening vigils for Black Lives Matter on the front lawn. This is a part of our continued and diverse efforts towards building anti-racism into our church life. And we also invite you to join us at coffee hour after the service. We'll have Zoom.
But we'll be there.
And it will be up on the screen. Oh, and next week we will actually, pardon me, we'll actually be live streaming the worship services from the General Assembly. So stay tuned for that. We'll go ahead and redirect our whole national community towards the General Assembly stream.
And please note that service starts at 10 a.m. So that will take up our spiritual adventures time as well as our normal service time. You'll see in the UUFYI, the two speakers are listed. I think they both sound, very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And there's our Zoom meeting code.
Yep. We will show that again at the end of the service.
Absolutely.
For our closing words today, I have this short poem by Maya Angelou. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. Lift up your eyes upon the day breaking before you. Give birth again to the dream.
These words as we send our flame are by Deborah Hafner. As we enter another week of uncertainty in the world, let us remember the power of this tiny flame. May this flame inspire us to pray for peace. May this flame inspire us to raise our voices with our elected officials. May this flame inspire us when we see acts of injustice to engage in acts of resistance. And let us remember to take very good care of ourselves, each other, and those we love.